The smell hit them first, old leather and cave moss, then something older underneath. 3 bow hunters crouched at the limestone mouth on that October morning in 2007, and what they saw inside would rewrite everything locals thought they knew about the man who'd lived alone in these hills for 30 years. Deep in the Ozark Plateau, where Missouri bleeds into Arkansas and hollers swallow sound, a man named Silas Kern had built a life of deliberate isolation. The residents of Caulfield, population 412, spoke his name in whispers at the Copper Bell Diner, always with that particular sideways glance reserved for those who choose trees over people. Silas wasn't hostile. He simply preferred the company of silence. Every third Thursday, he'd emerge from his unmarked dirt road to buy supplies at Morton's General: canned beans, lamp oil, salt in bulk. He paid in cash worn soft from handling, never made eye contact, never explained the canvas bags he carried out, bulging with items that made the cashier's pen pause over the receipt. "Man's got a right to his own business," old Morton would say, shutting down gossip before it flowered. But gossip has roots deeper than reason. By 2003, stories had calcified into local mythology. Silas collected bones. That much seemed certain. Deer skulls lined his property fence like sentries, bleached white by sun and winter. Hunters reported finding vertebrae arrangements in the woods, small skeletal sculptures that served no purpose they could name. One teenager swore he'd glimpsed human skulls through a cabin window during a dare-fueled trespass, though his friends called him a liar, and his mother grounded him for a month for even suggesting such darkness. The law never got involved. No missing persons, no evidence. Just the perpetual unease that settles over a community when someone lives too far outside the margins of acceptable strangeness. Then Silas Kern stopped coming to town, his last purchase at Morton's, August 9th, 2006. 22 pounds of salt, 3 gallons of vinegar, a new skinning knife with a bone handle. Morton remembered because Silas had lingered an extra moment, fingers drumming the counter, before asking if the store still carried that particular brand of lye soap. They didn't. He'd nodded once and left, boots tracking red clay across linoleum. 12 months passed, then 18. The Kern property, 47 acres of oak and limestone, sat undisturbed. Mail piled up in a rusted box until the postmaster finally stopped delivering. The county assumed he'd moved on, maybe died quietly in his cabin the way hermits sometimes do, body undiscovered until the structure collapsed decades later. But on October 14th, 2007, 3 men tracking a wounded buck stumbled into a cave system 2 miles from Kern's last known residence. Jake Holloway, Marcus Webb, and 17-year-old Ethan Webb had been hunting since dawn. The buck, a 10-pointer Marcus had tagged badly, left a blood trail that led them off established paths into a section of ridgeland locals called the Devil's Backbone. Limestone outcroppings jutted from hillsides like exposed ribs. Sinkholes opened without warning. The air tasted of mineral and rot. "Trail goes in there," Jake said, pointing toward a crack in the rock face barely wider than a man's shoulders. Marcus wanted to turn back. His son Ethan, still young enough to confuse bravery with recklessness, squeezed through first. The passage opened after 12 feet of crawling, widened into a chamber large enough to stand, to breathe, to comprehend the impossible geometry of what someone had built in absolute darkness. Shelves carved into limestone walls, wooden platforms suspended by rope that should have rotted years ago, and skulls. Rows upon rows of human skulls, each one positioned with museum-like precision, each one marked with symbols that predated any alphabet the men recognized. 216 skulls, they'd later learn, each carved with intricate patterns that spiraled from eye socket to crown, geometric designs that seemed to shift in the hunter's flashlight beams, symbols that ached to look at too long. Where are you watching from? What time is it in your corner of the world right now? Drop a comment below, and if you're ready to follow this darkness deeper, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to see where this leads. But standing in that cave, surrounded by the carefully curated dead, Jake Holloway had only one coherent thought. This wasn't random collection. This was a life's work. A folding chair sat in the chamber's center, positioned for optimal viewing. Beside it, a lantern still held oil, and on the cave floor, traced in what appeared to be bone dust, a massive spiral pattern led from the entrance to a narrower passage at the back, a tunnel the men's lights couldn't penetrate, where the air moved with breath-like rhythm. The skull collection was a doorway, they realized, not the destination. Marcus Webb's hand shook so badly the flashlight beam scattered across bone. The three men stood frozen in that limestone chamber, and the question burning through their shock was simple. Whose skulls were these? And how had no one noticed 200 people vanishing from the Ozarks? Jake Holloway, a former paramedic who'd seen his share of death, moved first. He approached the nearest shelf with the careful steps of someone navigating a crime scene, which is exactly what this was. The skulls weren't jumbled or carelessly stacked. Each occupied its own space, angled slightly forward as if watching the chamber's center. Some showed the deep brown patina of age. Others gleamed with a freshness that made Jake's stomach clench. "We need to leave," Marcus said. "Right now. Get the sheriff." But Ethan had already moved toward the back passage, drawn by teenage invincibility and the kind of curiosity that overrides survival instinct. His father's shout came too late. The boy squeezed into the narrower tunnel, his light bobbing deeper into the mountain's throat. "Ethan!" Marcus lunged after him, Jake close behind. The passage descended at a steep angle, smooth as if water had carved it over centuries. 20 feet down, it opened into a second chamber, smaller, cruder, and infinitely more disturbing. This was where Silas Kern had lived. A bedroll lay against one wall, still carrying the depression of a human form. Shelves held books with broken spines, anatomy texts from the 1930s, theological treatises in German, hand-bound journals filled with sketches that made Jake turn pages faster, trying to understand what he was seeing. Diagrams of the human skull from every angle, maps of the Ozark region with specific locations marked in red ink, and symbols, the same spiraling geometric patterns carved into the skulls above, reproduced obsessively across hundreds of pages. But it was the workbench that stopped all three men cold. Tools arranged with surgical precision, bone saws, dental picks, brushes with bristles worn to nubs, glass jars filled with liquids whose purposes Jake didn't want to guess. And in the center, under a protective cloth that Ethan foolishly pulled back, sat an unfinished skull still locked in its wooden vise, half its surface carved with patterns, the other half blank and waiting. Fresh. The bone was fresh. "He was here recently," Jake whispered. "Maybe days ago." A camping stove held a pot with residue at the bottom. Matches lay scattered beside it, and pinned to the wall above the workbench, a map of the United States with 23 locations marked. Each one dated, each one checked off except for a single red circle in northern Arkansas, labeled with a question mark and a date. October 20th, 2007. 6 days from now. What would you do in that moment? Turn back and wait for authorities? Or push deeper, knowing something was still unfolding? Marcus made the decision for them. He grabbed his son's shoulder and pulled him toward the exit passage. "We're getting law enforcement. Now." They crawled back through the entrance, emerging into afternoon sunlight that felt obscene after the cave's darkness. Jake marked the location with his GPS unit. Latitude 36.71 north, longitude 92.38 west, while Marcus used his cell phone, praying for signal on the ridge. 1 bar. Enough. The call reached the Ozark County Sheriff's Department at 3:47 p.m. Deputy Sarah Chen took the report, her pen pausing when Marcus said the word skulls. She asked him to repeat the number. 200. Plus 16, he corrected, voice cracking. 216 human skulls in a cave. "Stay where you are," Chen said. "Don't let anyone else near that location." The response was overwhelming. By sunset, 12 officers had cordoned off the area. By midnight, FBI field agents from Springfield had assumed jurisdiction. By dawn, forensic anthropologists from 3 universities were cataloging what the press would soon call the Kern collection, though that name felt too academic, too clean for what they'd found. Dr. Elizabeth Mora from the University of Arkansas led the bone analysis. In her preliminary report, later leaked to the Kansas City Star, she noted several disturbing facts. The skulls represented both sexes, ranging in age from late teens to 70s. Dental work suggested they spanned at least 8 decades, from the early 1900s to the present day. Most showed signs of careful cleaning and preservation, boiling, bleaching, detailed articulation. The carving had been done post-mortem, each symbol etched with obsessive precision, using tools that left microscopic striations in the bone. But here's what made Dr. Mora request additional security. The patterns weren't random decoration. They were a language. A graduate student specializing in ancient symbology recognized elements from multiple traditions: pre-Columbian glyphs, medieval alchemical signs, symbols from Sumerian burial practices. Someone had created a hybrid writing system and inscribed it on human remains with the dedication of a medieval monk illuminating manuscripts. The cave held a library written in bone, and its author, Silas Kern, had vanished before anyone could ask him what story he'd been trying to tell, or why 23 locations on his map suggested the collection was far from complete. The cabin stood empty, door hanging open like a broken jaw. When investigators finally reached Silas Kern's property on October 16th, they expected answers. What they found instead were more questions carved into every surface of a life deliberately erased. The structure itself was small, maybe 400 square feet, built from salvaged lumber and stones pulled from the surrounding hills. No electricity, no plumbing. A hand-dug well sat 30 yards away, its water tested later and found clean. Inside, the air held that particular stillness of abandonment, dust suspended in afternoon light filtering through gaps in the roof. FBI Special Agent David Marsh led the search team. He'd worked missing persons for 14 years, developed an instinct for reading absence. The way objects left behind told stories about the people who'd owned them. But Kern's cabin resisted narrative. It was less a home than a way station, a place someone passed through without leaving fingerprints on their own life. 1 chair, 1 plate, 1 cup, a sleeping bag on a wooden frame. Shelves held canned goods dated back to 2003. Their labels faded but contents still sealed. A wood stove squatted in the corner, ashes cold for months. And books. Hundreds of books stacked floor to ceiling, their subjects ranging from quantum physics to medieval mysticism, many with margins filled in cramped handwriting that would take linguistic experts weeks to decode. He was educated, Marsh noted into his recorder. Self-taught or formally, we'll need to verify. But this isn't a simple hermit. This is someone who chose isolation for a purpose. The journals came next. 47 notebooks discovered in a locked trunk beneath the floorboards, each one filled with observations that started mundane. Weather patterns, animal migrations, seasonal changes, then spiraled into something else entirely. By Journal 12, dated from 1997, Kern's entries had shifted focus. Found another. Creek bed, 3 miles southeast. Deer had scattered the bones, but the skull remained intact. 42 years old, male, died of blunt trauma. The pattern wants to be seen. I can feel it asking. The entries continued for a decade, cataloging discoveries across 4 states. Kern hadn't killed anyone. Forensic evidence would later confirm this beyond doubt. He'd been a collector, a scavenger who somehow knew where to find the forgotten dead. Bodies buried in shallow graves decades prior. Remains from unsolved cases that predated modern record-keeping. The disappeared whose families had long stopped searching. But how had he known where to look? Dr. Patricia Voss, a psychiatrist brought in to profile Kern based on his writings, proposed something that made the investigation team uncomfortable. Silas Kern believed the dead called to him, not metaphorically. His journals described sensations, pulses in his temples, metallic tastes, dreams that showed him specific locations with GPS-level accuracy. He'd marked these coordinates, traveled sometimes hundreds of miles, and returned with skulls that DNA analysis eventually matched to cold cases stretching back to the 1920s. He saw himself as a curator, Voss explained in her assessment. Someone preserving what would otherwise be lost. The symbols weren't desecration. They were his attempt at translation. He thought the bones contained information, and he was trying to decode it. The investigation team found his carving station in a shed behind the cabin, a workspace far more sophisticated than the crude living quarters. Magnifying lamps, precision tools ordered through specialty catalogs, reference materials on phonetics and linguistic structures, and a map identical to the one found in the cave, with those 23 locations marked. 18 were checked off. 5 remained, including the October 20th date circled in northern Arkansas. Sheriff Thomas Breck of Ozark County had lived in these hills for 53 years. His grandfather had known these woods before highways cut through them. When Marsh showed him the map, asking if he recognized the pattern in Kern's marked locations, Breck's weathered face went pale. "That's old burial grounds," he said quietly. "Not official cemeteries. Places where folks buried family on their own land back when that was common. Most of them forgotten now, property sold and resold, records lost. How would Kern know about them?" Breck had no answer, but he pulled county records dating back to 1870, and sure enough, 8 of Kern's marked locations corresponded to documented family plots that had been abandoned when the original homesteads failed. Someone had taught him, or something had. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: Morton's General Store. The owner, cleaning out old receipts for tax purposes, found a pattern in Kern's purchases that matched the timeline in his journals. Every time Kern bought salt and vinegar in bulk, materials used for cleaning bones, it corresponded to a new entry describing a discovery. The dates aligned perfectly with his marked map locations: 31 trips over 13 years. 31 skulls he'd personally recovered from sites no one else knew existed. But the cave held 216 skulls, which meant 185 had come from somewhere or someone else. And Silas Kern's journals never mentioned a source, never described receiving shipments or meeting collaborators. The skulls simply appeared in his entries, already present, waiting to be carved with their designated symbols. Agent Marsh stood in the empty cabin at dusk, trying to reconcile the evidence with any rational explanation. A man living alone in the woods for 3 decades, creating an underground ossuary using human remains he somehow located with impossible accuracy, inscribing them with a language that specialists couldn't fully translate, working toward some purpose he'd never articulated to another living soul, and then vanishing 6 days before a date he'd marked as significant, leaving behind a collection that suggested his work, whatever it was, remained unfinished. The question wasn't just where Silas Kern had gone. It was what happened when his deadline arrived. The translation came from an unexpected place, a retired linguistics professor in Vermont who'd spent 40 years studying dead languages. Dr. Raymond Kolchak saw the photographs on a forensic anthropology forum where specialists were crowd-shooting the Kern symbols, and something in those spiraling patterns triggered a memory from his doctoral research in 1973. He called the FBI field office in Springfield at 2 a.m., apologizing for the hour but insisting they needed to hear what he'd recognized. "Those aren't decorative," Kolchak said, his voice carrying the tremor of someone who'd just glimpsed something they'd thought was purely theoretical. "They're directional markers, wayfinding symbols used in pre-Christian burial traditions across 3 continents. Someone's been building a map." Agent Marsh had Kolchak on a plane by noon. The professor arrived at the FBI's temporary command center, a requisitioned community center in Caulfield, carrying boxes of research materials that smelled of library basements and forgotten archives. He spread photographs of the skulls across folding tables, arranging them not by the order they'd been found, but by the complexity of their carved patterns. And suddenly, the chaos resolved into sequence. "See this?" Kolchak pointed to a skull with relatively simple markings, 3 intersecting lines radiating from the crown. "This is foundational, a coordinate system establishing orientation, north, south, east, west, but also up and down. 6 directions instead of 4. This individual," he gestured to the bones themselves, speaking of them with uncomfortable reverence, "represents a point of origin." He moved to another skull, this one covered in more elaborate spirals. This one shows distance and relationship. The density of the carving indicates proximity to the origin point. "And these symbols here," his finger traced a pattern around the eye socket, "are temporal markers, not dates as we'd understand them, but sequences. 1st, 2nd, 3rd. The 20 federal agents and forensic specialists in the room watched in silence as Kolchak worked through dozens of skulls, his translation growing more confident with each explanation. What emerged wasn't random collection, but deliberate architecture. Silas Kern had been constructing something in 3 dimensions, using human remains as the building blocks. "It's a star chart," Kolchak finally said, "but not of the sky we see. He's mapped something else. Underground maybe, or..." He paused, reconsidering. The symbols suggest layered reality, multiple spaces occupying the same location. Dr. Elizabeth Mora, the anthropologist who'd first noted the linguistic patterns, spoke up. "You're saying Kern believed these skulls pointed to other places?" "I'm saying the system he was using was designed for exactly that purpose. In Sumerian tradition, certain burial sites were considered doorways. The Celts had similar concepts. Thin places where the boundary between worlds grew permeable. Kern's hybrid system pulls from all of them. Kolchak's hands shook slightly as he arranged more photographs. He was creating a key, or a map to something that exists in relation to our world, but not quite within it. The room temperature seemed to drop. Agent Marsh cleared his throat. "Doctor, we appreciate the historical context, but we're investigating a crime scene, not—" "Then explain the DNA results," Kolchak interrupted, pulling a report from his materials that shouldn't have been in his possession. Someone on the forensic team had leaked more than photographs. The DNA analysis of the 216 skulls had revealed something that the FBI had been keeping quiet while they verified and re-verified their findings. 16 of the skulls didn't match any database, any missing persons report, any known human population genetics. Their mitochondrial DNA showed markers that suggested divergence from modern humans somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years ago. They were human, but not quite. "Neanderthal remnants?" someone suggested weakly. "Neanderthals died out 40,000 years ago," Mora said, "and their DNA signature is well documented. This is something else, a population that either evolved in isolation or—" She stopped, unwilling to finish the thought. Kolchak finished it for her. "Or came from somewhere our evolutionary models don't account for." Which brings us back to Kern's purpose. He wasn't just collecting. He was gathering specific individuals whose remains served as markers for locations that our normal geography doesn't recognize. The journals supported this interpretation. In entries from 2005, Kern described his methodology. The old ones knew. They buried their dead at the crossing points, the places where the skin of the world grows thin enough to see through. Modern people pave over these sites, build strip malls and parking lots, never knowing what they're standing on. But the bones remember. They hold the coordinates even after everything else forgets. Further entries detailed his carving process, how each symbol had to be placed with precision, how the angle and depth mattered, how rushing the work could close the path and require him to start over. He spent months on single skulls, cross-referencing texts in languages he'd taught himself, verifying patterns through methods he never fully explained, and always that sense of urgency building through the later journals. Time running short, the window narrowing, something approaching that required completion. The October 20th date. "What happens then?" Marsh demanded. "What did he think was going to occur?" Kolchak sorted through Kern's final journal entries, the ones from summer 2006, just before he disappeared from Caulfield's general store for the last time. The alignment comes once per generation, maybe less. The old texts disagree on the cycle, but they all confirm the necessity of the threshold being complete. 216 points make the sphere. 216 voices to call across the distance. I have 18 left to find. The coordinates are clear now. I can feel them pulling. October 20th at the convergence. If I'm not ready, another 40 years lost. I'll be dead. The work will die with me. 18 skulls short of completion, and 5 locations on his map still unchecked, including whatever he'd marked for 6 days after the hunters found his cave. The question burning through everyone's mind: had Silas Kern given up when he realized he couldn't finish in time? Or was he still out there, racing against his deadline with a desperation that made him unpredictable in ways the investigation hadn't yet considered? October 20th, 2007 arrived under a moonless sky and temperatures that dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. The FBI had identified Kern's final marked location through intensive map analysis. A section of the Buffalo National River drainage where 3 defunct family cemeteries formed a rough triangle, their center point an unremarkable clearing that official surveys showed as empty forest. Agent Marsh assembled a team of 16, 10 federal agents, 4 county deputies, including Sheriff Breck, and 2 forensic specialists in case they found what they were expecting. What they were expecting was a body. Silas Kern, dead by his own hand after failing to complete his obsessive project, choosing the site of his final intended work as his resting place. What they found instead would force everyone present to question the neat boundaries between investigation and experience. They reached the clearing at dusk, hiking 2 miles from the nearest logging road. The forest here grew dense, oak and hickory crowding close, their branches forming a canopy that blocked what little light remained. Ground fog rolled through in waves, carrying the mineral smell of limestone caves and something else underneath, something organic and old. The clearing itself measured roughly 40 feet across, ringed by stones that might have been natural or deliberately placed generations ago. No structures, no obvious signs of disturbance, just forest floor covered in decades of leaf litter and the particular silence that settles over places animals avoid instinctively. "Fan out," Marsh ordered. "Standard search pattern. Look for fresh digging, recent activity, anything that doesn't belong." They found nothing. 2 hours of systematic searching with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar showed undisturbed soil. No graves, no hidden chambers, no evidence that Silas Kern or anyone else had visited this location in years. But as night fell completely and they prepared to pack up their equipment, Deputy Sarah Chen noticed something that made her freeze mid-motion. "The stones," she said quietly. "They're warm." Impossible. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. Everything should have been cold to the touch. But when Marsh placed his palm against the nearest stone, a limestone boulder roughly 3 feet tall, it radiated heat like it had been sitting in summer sun. All 17 stones ringing the clearing showed the same impossible warmth. "Equipment malfunction," someone suggested. "Thermal reflection from our lights." They killed all lights, stood in complete darkness, and watched as the stones began to glow with a faint phosphorescence that had nothing to do with reflected illumination. A blue-green luminescence that pulsed with irregular rhythm, almost like breathing. Sheriff Breck, who'd been silent for most of the operation, spoke with the careful tone of someone trying to maintain sanity against evidence that threatened it. "My grandfather told stories about lights in these woods, called them the old marks. Said the Cherokee wouldn't hunt here after dark, and the settlers who ignored that advice sometimes didn't come back." "Foxfire," Agent Marsh said, trying to anchor the moment to something explainable. "Bioluminescent fungi, common in limestone regions." But foxfire didn't pulse in synchronized rhythm, didn't grow brighter as they watched, didn't make the air inside the stone circle feel noticeably warmer, even as the surrounding forest grew colder. Dr. Mora, the anthropologist, had brought measurement equipment, barometers, electromagnetic field detectors, instruments designed to record environmental anomalies. She set them up at the clearing center while the team watched the stones continue their impossible display. At 10:43 p.m., every instrument spiked simultaneously. Barometric pressure dropped as if a storm system had appeared from nowhere. Electromagnetic readings surged beyond the equipment's capacity to measure, and the temperature inside the stone circle jumped from 38 degrees to 72 in under 90 seconds, while the forest beyond remained freezing. "We need to leave," Chen said, hand moving to her sidearm, though she had nothing to draw it against. But Marsh made a decision that he'd later struggle to justify in official reports. "We stay. Document everything. This is what Kern was tracking. This is what he believed would happen." The glow intensified, and in that blue-green light, patterns became visible on the stone surfaces, carvings so weathered by time they'd been invisible in daylight, but now standing out in sharp relief. The same symbols found on Kern's skulls, the same geometric spirals and directional markers. Ancient hands had marked these stones using the exact system that Silas Kern had spent 13 years reproducing in bone. He hadn't created the language. He'd been copying it. At 11:17 p.m., the sound started. Not quite a hum, not quite a vibration. Something felt as much as heard, resonating in chest cavities and inner ears, a frequency that made teeth ache and thoughts scatter. Several team members stumbled, disoriented. One agent vomited from the sensory disruption. Marsh himself felt reality wobble at the edges, the clearing seeming to expand and contract simultaneously, distances becoming unreliable. And in the center, where no one had been standing, where Dr. Mora's equipment had recorded impossibilities, the air split. Not metaphorically. The atmosphere tore like fabric, opening a vertical seam roughly 7 feet tall that showed nothing. Not darkness, not light. An absence of visual information that hurt to perceive, as if the human brain lacked the processing capacity to interpret what it was seeing. The FBI's official report would call it a localized atmospheric anomaly of unknown origin. Privately, every person present knew they'd witnessed something that shouldn't exist according to any framework of natural law they understood. The rift lasted 4 minutes, long enough for Marsh to approach within 10 feet, flashlight beam disappearing into that impossible void without illuminating anything. Long enough for the team's cameras to capture footage that later analysis would show contained no actual visual data, just static and distortion where the opening had been. Long enough for everyone to understand viscerally what Silas Kern had been working toward. He'd been trying to open this, or keep it closed. The journals never quite made clear which. Then, as abruptly as it began, the phenomenon ceased. The sound stopped. The temperature normalized. The stone glow faded to nothing. The rift sealed itself, leaving behind only the smell of ozone and 14 people whose hands shook too badly to properly pack their equipment. They hiked out in silence, no one trusting their ability to articulate what they'd experienced. Back at the command center, Marsh filed the minimum necessary paperwork and ordered the clearing off limits pending further investigation. But he knew, and his team knew, that no further investigation would occur. Some questions don't have answers that fit in official channels. Some phenomena exist in spaces between the explainable and the impossible, and poking at them too aggressively risks consequences no one wants to consider. Silas Kern had understood this, had spent 30 years learning the boundaries of that in-between space, mapping its coordinates in bone and symbol, preparing for a convergence he believed required completion. He'd fallen 18 skulls short, and whatever should have happened that night remained unfinished, waiting for the next alignment, the next desperate scholar willing to read what the dead had written in the language of thin places and crossing points. The official file closed on November 3rd, 2007, but the questions multiplied in the silence that followed. FBI Special Agent David Marsh submitted his final report with language so carefully sanitized that it rendered the investigation almost meaningless. Subject remains at large. Case transferred to missing persons database. evidence cataloged and secured pending further developments. The 216 skulls were transported to a federal facility in Virginia, where they sit today in climate-controlled storage. Their carved symbols photographed, but never fully decoded. Their origins traced where possible, but 18 remaining completely unidentified, even with modern forensic technology. Silas Kern was never found. But the investigation's final weeks revealed details that painted a picture far more complex than the simple hermit-collector narrative the media eventually settled on. Details that Marsh's team uncovered and then quietly buried in supplementary reports that required security clearance to access. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: property records going back to 1862. A researcher combing through historical documents in Jefferson City discovered that the land Kern had lived on, those 47 acres in the Ozark Plateau, had been in his family for 5 generations. Not purchased, inherited. The original deed holder was listed as Ephraim Kern, a Union Army deserter who'd fled to the Missouri hills in 1863 and established a homestead that his descendants maintained in unbroken succession. Each generation produced one son who stayed, one keeper of the land who never married, never integrated with surrounding communities, and lived in deliberate isolation. Census records confirmed the pattern. 1865, 1897, 1928, 1954, and finally Silas, born 1951. 5 generations, 5 solitary men. And when investigators examined death certificates, they found something that made the pattern even more disturbing. None of the previous Kern men had died of natural causes. Ephraim, suicide by hanging, 1893. Josiah, disappeared in 1924, presumed dead. Marcus, killed in a hunting accident, 1950. William, suicide by firearm, 1976. Every Kern keeper died violently or vanished, and each time, a son had already reached adulthood to assume the property and continue whatever work they'd been maintaining. But Silas Kern had no children, no wife, no heir to inherit the knowledge or the burden. The last of his line. Dr. Patricia Voss, the psychiatrist who'd profiled Kern, proposed a theory that the investigation team found simultaneously compelling and deeply unsettling. This wasn't mental illness in the conventional sense, she wrote in her supplementary analysis. This was inherited purpose. Each generation trained the next, passed down methodologies and objectives that existed outside normal human motivation. Silas wasn't collecting skulls because of personal pathology. He was completing a multi-generational project that his great-great-grandfather began over a century ago. The journals supported this. In entries from 1977, just after his father's death, a 26-year-old Silas described finding the teaching materials hidden beneath the cabin. Boxes of documents, maps, and bone samples that William had accumulated but never completed working on. Previous generations had all contributed. Ephraim had identified the locations. Josiah had developed the symbol system by cross-referencing texts he'd somehow acquired. Marcus had refined the carving techniques. William had expanded the collection significantly. And Silas, the final inheritor, had pushed the work toward its conclusion with single-minded intensity that consumed 30 years of his life. But why? What were 5 generations of Kern men trying to accomplish? The answer, pieced together from journal fragments and historical documents, suggested something that conventional investigation couldn't accommodate. The Kerns believed they were maintaining a seal, that the convergence points Silas mapped weren't doorways to be opened, but ruptures to be contained, and that the carefully arranged skulls with their precise symbols served as anchors holding something back. In his earliest journal, written at age 27, Silas recorded what his father had told him before dying. "We don't understand what we're guarding against." Grandfather didn't know. His father didn't know. But Ephraim saw something in the war, something that followed him from Shiloh's battlefield that wasn't smoke or cannon fire. He tracked it here, to these hills where the Cherokee had already marked the crossing points with stones and warnings. He learned their system, improved it, and taught his son that some knowledge is kept, not because it's valuable, but because forgetting it would be catastrophic. The investigation team found one more crucial piece of evidence in late October, a letter discovered in William Kern's effects, written in 1892 by Ephraim to his son Josiah. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words remained legible. "When the alignment comes and you are not ready, do not attempt the working. Better to let the cycle pass than to open what cannot be closed. I have seen what waits on the other side. It has patience beyond human reckoning. It will wait another 40 years. It will wait 1,000. But it will not forget. And it will not cease trying to cross." 18 skulls short. Silas Kern had spent 13 years gathering the final pieces of a project 5 generations in the making, racing against a deadline he inherited rather than chose. And when October 20th approached, and he must have known, that he couldn't complete the work in time, he'd made a choice. Sheriff Breck found the evidence in early November while doing a final sweep of the Kern property. A small fire pit behind the cabin, recently used, containing ashes and partially burned papers. Among them, fragments of journal pages from 2007. 18 short, 18 points where the sphere remains incomplete. I've failed every man who came before me, failed the burden they died carrying. But I will not attempt the working half-finished. Better to disappear than to risk opening what I cannot seal. The last dated entry, October 10th, 2007. 4 days before the hunters found the cave. 10 days before the convergence. Silas Kern had known his collection was incomplete, had known the deadline approached, and rather than attempt a working that might fail catastrophically, he'd chosen to vanish, taking with him whatever knowledge remained about the project's true purpose, leaving behind only the evidence of obsession without the context to understand it. Where he went, no one discovered. Some speculated he'd walked into the deep woods and ended the Kern line as his ancestors had, violently, deliberately, carrying secrets into whatever darkness waited. Others suggested he was still out there, living under a different name, having abandoned the burden that had consumed 5 generations. But Agent Marsh, reviewing the evidence one final time before sealing the file, kept returning to one detail: the map with its 23 locations, 18 checked, 5 remaining. And the October 20th date circled in red with a notation beneath in Kern's cramped handwriting. If I am not there, someone else will need to be. The working requires presence. The alignment will occur regardless. Without the anchor, the rupture completes on its own. The clearing in the Buffalo National River drainage remained cordoned for 6 months after the investigation concluded. Then quietly, without public announcement, the barriers came down. The site was released back to the National Park Service with no explanation, no warning, no indication that 16 federal agents had witnessed something there that defied explanation. And 40 years from October 20th, 2007, the alignment will come again. No one trained to meet it, no collection to anchor the working, just empty forest and stones that remember what humans have chosen to forget. The cave was sealed in March 2008, concrete and rebar blocking the entrance like a tomb. But sealing a location doesn't erase what happened there. And the Ozark Plateau remembers in ways that official closure can't contain. In the stories locals stopped telling outsiders, in the hunting trails that experienced guides now avoid, in the small decisions people make without quite understanding why. Jake Holloway, the former paramedic who'd first entered Kern's bone chamber, sold his property and moved to Springfield 6 months after the discovery. He gave no interviews, responded to no inquiries, and when a documentary crew tracked him down in 2011, he closed the door in their faces after saying only, "Some things shouldn't be studied. Some things should be left alone." Marcus and Ethan Webb still live in Caulfield. The father stopped hunting entirely. The son, now 24 and working as an electrician in nearby Mountain View, occasionally posts on regional forums under a pseudonym, responding to curiosity seekers who ask about the Kern case with variations of the same warning. The official story is incomplete. What they found in that cave was just the surface. If you're smart, you'll leave it there. When pressed for details, he never elaborates. The town itself, population now down to 371, developed an unspoken agreement about how to handle questions from outsiders. Tourists still come, drawn by internet speculation and true crime podcasts that rehash the mystery. The Copper Bell Diner serves them coffee and misdirection in equal measure. Yes, they remember Silas Kern. No, nobody knew him well. The cave? Dangerous formation, sealed for safety. Nothing mysterious about preventing liability, but Morton's General Store, where Kern made his final purchase in August 2006, closed permanently in 2009. The owner, Bill Morton, retired at 63 despite being in good health and turned the property over to his daughter, who converted it into a vacation rental that never mentions its history. The original sales, receipts, the ones that tracked Kern's purchases, were destroyed per Bill's instructions, fed into a burn barrel behind his house on a January night when the temperature dropped below zero. "Don't need that energy around," he told his daughter. "Some transactions shouldn't be preserved." Dr. Raymond Kolchak, the linguistics professor who'd translated Kern's symbols, published no papers about his findings. His colleagues at the University of Vermont noted a marked change in his research focus. He abandoned his life's work on dead languages and pivoted to environmental studies, specifically watershed conservation in New England. When a graduate student asked him about the Ozark case in 2012, Kolchak's response was uncharacteristically sharp. "I translated what I could. The rest wasn't meant for human eyes. Leave it encrypted." He died in 2019 at age 82. His research materials on the Kern symbols were not among his archived papers. The 216 skulls remain in federal storage, but their catalog entry is deliberately vague. Unprovenanced skeletal material from multi-jurisdictional investigation. Requests to study them are denied without explanation. The 16 skulls with anomalous DNA were separated from the main collection, and their current location is classified at a level that suggests military rather than civilian oversight. Whatever they represented, someone decided the information posed risks that outweighed scientific value. But perhaps the most telling legacy of the Kern case is what didn't happen. The 5 unchecked locations on Silas's map, the sites he'd identified but never visited, remained exactly that. No follow-up investigation, no archaeological surveys, no academic interest in what might be found at those coordinates. The FBI's supplementary files contain recommendations that those locations be administratively designated as low-priority pending resource availability, which is bureaucratic language for "never touch this again." One of those locations sits on private land in northern Arkansas, property owned by a family named Whitmore, who farmed it for 3 generations. In 2013, a geological survey team requested access to conduct routine groundwater testing. The family refused. When the state offered compensation, they refused again. When legal pressure was applied through eminent domain proceedings, the family hired lawyers and fought a 2-year battle that eventually resulted in the survey being canceled for budgetary reasons. The Whitmores never explained their resistance. But property records show that their land has been in the family since 1857, and county historians note that the original deed contained an unusual covenant, requiring all future owners to maintain the northern 40 acres in perpetual natural state, unmarked and undisturbed. The same kind of covenant that Ephraim Kern had placed on his property in 1863. How many other families hold similar obligations? How many properties across the Ozarks carry restrictions whose original purposes have been forgotten, but whose enforcement continues through generations, simply because that's how it's always been done? Agent David Marsh retired from the FBI in 2015 and now lives in Colorado, as far from the Ozark Plateau as he could get, while remaining in the continental United States. He granted one interview to a researcher in 2018, speaking on condition of anonymity. We found what Kern collected. We documented his methods. We witnessed phenomena at that clearing that can't be explained through conventional means. But the real investigation, the one that would have asked what 5 generations of men were actually doing, what they believed they were preventing, whether their beliefs had any basis in reality, that investigation never happened. Because the answer might have required responses we weren't prepared to implement. Better to seal the cave, classify the files, and pretend it was just an eccentric hermit collecting bones. Easier to sleep that way. When asked if he thought the phenomena would return, Marsh's response was carefully measured. Kern's journals said the alignment occurs every 40 years. He marked October 20th, 2007. You can do the math. October 20th, 2047. 40 years from the convergence that Silas Kern spent his life preparing for. 40 years from the working he couldn't complete. 40 years for whatever waits at those crossing points to gather strength, to press against the barriers that 5 generations of Kerns believed they were maintaining. The forest doesn't care about human timelines. The stones around that clearing will still be there, marked with symbols that predate written history. The thin places where Kern believed reality grew permeable won't thicken simply because the mapmaker vanished. And if Ephraim Kern was right, if what he saw following him from Shiloh's battlefield had patience beyond human reckoning, then 40 years is barely a pause in its waiting. The locals in Caulfield don't talk about 2047, but the younger families, the ones with children who'll be adults by then, have started making quiet decisions. Moving to larger towns for better opportunities, taking jobs in Kansas City or St. Louis, establishing roots elsewhere. Not everyone, not overtly, but enough that the population decline has accelerated, enough that the elementary school closed in 2021 for lack of students, enough that property values in a 100-mile radius of that sealed cave have dropped 20% below comparable Ozark real estate. People feel it without naming it. The sense that something unfinished waits in these hills, and that October 20th, 2047, might bring consequences for an inheritance no one claimed. Silas Kern vanished. His cave was sealed. His collection was cataloged and locked away. But on quiet nights in the Ozark Plateau, hunters still report seeing lights moving through the forest with purposeful direction. Not quite flashlights, not quite natural, heading toward locations marked on a map that 5 generations of men died trying to complete. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.